Bartholomew Crane slapped 13 cents onto the counter like he was swatting a fly. "You're 2 cents short," he said, and his voice had that particular softness that men use when they want you to know exactly how little they think of you. He didn't look at Lenora Whitfield when he said it. He looked at the bread. Then he slid it back behind the counter with one finger, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he knows nobody in the room will stop him. Lenora stood there with every coin she owned spread across that counter, and the whole store went quiet. "My husband worked that mine for 6 years," she said. Crane smiled. "And now he doesn't." If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Stories like Lenora's don't come around often, and we're just getting started. Like this video, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Briar Ridge, Colorado, 1887, and find out what 13 cents really cost. The summer of 1887 had no mercy for anyone who couldn't afford to buy some. Briar Ridge sat at the foot of the San Juan Range, like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten 24 buildings strung along a single main street, a creek that ran brown after rain, and enough dust to choke a mule from May through September. It wasn't a town so much as a gathering of people who hadn't yet found a reason to leave. Some stayed because the mines paid. Some stayed because they owed money. Most stayed because leaving cost more than they had. Lenora Whitfield arrived on foot. She had walked 4 miles from the homestead because the mayor needed rest more than she did, and because she'd done the arithmetic that morning 3 times on the back of an old envelope, and each time it came out the same, 13 cents. That was what remained of the money Everett had left tucked inside the false bottom of the tin bread box, behind the place where the lining was starting to peel. 13 cents and a homestead at the foot of Cutter's Ridge, and a loan document she'd read so many times the fold lines were wearing through the paper. She pushed open the door of Crane's Mercantile just after 10 in the morning. The bell above the door announced her arrival to the 3 men already inside a rancher, examining harness leather near the back, old Dewey Stubbs asleep on the barrel he always occupied near the cold stove, and Barnabas Witt, the mine foreman, who stood at the counter buying tobacco and pretending not to notice her come in. Crane himself stood behind the counter. Bartholomew Crane was 51 years old and carried his wealth the way a man carries a weapon, always visible, always ready to be used. He was not large. That was the thing people who hadn't dealt with him sometimes didn't understand. They expected a man who controlled most of Briar Ridge's debt and half its property to look like something fearsome. But Crane was a compact, careful man with clean fingernails and mild eyes, and a voice that never needed to rise, because everyone in his path had already learned to listen. He smiled when Lenora walked in. That was always the first thing. "Mrs. Whitfield." He set down the ledger he'd been reviewing. "It's been a while. How are you managing out there?" The question meant nothing, and they both knew it. Crane knew exactly how she was managing. He knew about the pantry because Mrs. Hubble, who took in mending, had mentioned it to the pastor's wife, who had mentioned it to half of Briar Ridge. He knew about the missed payment because he held the promissory note with Everett's signature on it. He knew Lenora had been selling off pieces of Everett's equipment to cover what she could: the extra harness, 2 good shovels, the small iron hand drill Everett had been particularly proud of. Crane knew everything that happened to his debtors. That was how he stayed ahead of them. "I'd like a loaf of bread," Lenora said. "The brown one, if you have it." Crane turned and retrieved the loaf without being asked where she meant. He set it on the counter between them and named the price. Lenora set her 13 cents down coin by coin. She had counted them out in her palm the whole walk into town, rehearsing. The loaf cost 15 cents. She'd been hoping she'd misremembered the price from before, or that Crane might have lowered it. And this was the hope she'd pushed down hardest, because hoping for charity felt like practice for surrender, that he might simply let the 2 cents slide. He did not let the 2 cents slide. Crane looked at the 13 coins arranged on his counter, and then he looked at her, and his expression didn't change at all. That was almost the worst part. If he had been cruel about it, it would have been easier to hate cleanly. Instead, he had that mild, reasonable look, like a man who genuinely regretted that mathematics worked the way it did. You're 2 cents short, he said. I know I'm 2 cents short. The price is 15 cents, Mrs. Whitfield. Has been all month. From somewhere near the back of the store, Lenora heard the rancher examining harness leather go very still. My husband worked that mine for 6 years, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. He hauled ore out of red elk in 105-degree heat. He broke 3 ribs in a roof fall and came back the next week because we needed the pay. 6 years, and then one morning the section came down, and he didn't come home. Crane listened to all of this with the patience of a man who has heard many such explanations and found none of them financially relevant. I'm sorry about Everett, he said. I am. He was a decent man. But the bread costs 15 cents. He reached out and slid the loaf back behind the counter. Lenora stood looking at the empty space where it had been. She was aware of Barnabas Witt, still standing a few feet away, not looking at her, not moving. She was aware of old Dewey Stubbs, who had stopped pretending to be asleep. She was aware of the rancher in the back, who had gone as motionless as a man who doesn't want to be called as a witness. She was also aware that her stomach had been half empty since Tuesday. I'll have the 13 cents back, she said. Crane didn't move immediately. He considered her for a moment, that mild, measuring look, and then he pushed the coins across the counter toward her. But before she could take them, he said, almost conversationally, while you're here. Payment on your note was due on the 1st. Lenora stopped. I'm aware, she said. You're 18 days past. He had not needed to check any ledger to know this number. He had known it before she walked through the door. The interest has been accumulating. I imagine you know the language in the contract regarding delinquency. I know the language. Then you know I have certain options available to me. He said it the way he said everything, quiet, reasonable, no threat in the tone, just the fact of the thing sitting there between them. An option. Like a different brand of flour he might carry. Lenora picked up her 13 cents. She counted them back into her palm without looking at him. She could feel the weight of the store pressing around her, the attention of everyone trying to disappear, and somewhere in the back of her mind the arithmetic going again, running over the numbers that had kept her up for 5 months. The loan amount, and the interest clause, and the payment she'd missed, and the one she would miss again because there was no money coming in, and no way to make money come in because all of it went in circles and at. The center of every circle stood Bartholomew Crane. I have a proposal, Crane said. His voice was almost gentle. If you're willing to hear it. She made herself look at him. The land, he said. Everett's homestead. Given the loan balance and the accumulated interest, I would be willing to consider the property as full satisfaction of the debt. You'd walk away free and clear, no further obligation. For a moment, Lenora didn't say anything. She thought about the way Everett had laid the first foundation stones himself, hauling them from the creek bed one at a time on a borrowed mule. She thought about the morning he'd come in with his hands raw and bleeding and grinning like a boy, because the walls were finally at shoulder height and the place was starting to look like something. She thought about the garden plot he'd staked out on the south side, the one she'd replanted herself in April, because doing something with her hands was the only way she'd kept from losing her mind. No, she said. Crane looked at her the way a man looks at a weather vane pointing the wrong direction. Patient. Certain it would turn. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand there's sentiment involved. No, she said again. She put her 13 cents in her coat pocket and walked out. The bell above the door announced her departure to the same 3 men who hadn't moved the whole time, and she walked out into the August heat and turned toward the road home without stopping, and told herself she would not cry on Briar Ridge's Main Street, and kept that promise for exactly 100 yards, until she was past the last building and onto the wagon road, and then she stopped walking for a moment and put one hand against a fence post and just stood there. Her stomach hurt, not from hunger exactly, though that was part of it. From something that didn't have a clean name, the particular misery of owing a man who enjoys being owed. She pushed off the fence post and started walking. 4 miles was 4 miles. She had done it this morning and she would do it again. Gideon Mercer had been in the back corner of Crane's Mercantile from the moment Lenora walked in. He was there to buy winter trapping supplies, not an urgent errand in August, but Gideon's seasons ran different from most people's in Briar Ridge. He had learned from years in the high country that the men who survived winter were the ones who had finished preparing for it before the first cold snap. He'd had a list: tin for patching, beeswax cord, a new skinning blade to replace the one he'd cracked against a rock in March. He had been standing near the shelving along the far wall when Lenora came in and set 13 coins on the counter, and he had not moved while it happened. He was not a man who moved without thinking. Gideon was 38 years old and had been living in the mountains above Briar Ridge for the better part of a decade. He came into town for supplies and to sell his pelts to the trader, who came through twice a year, and other than that he kept largely to himself, which suited him fine and apparently suited Briar Ridge fine in return. He was not antisocial. He simply operated according to a different set of costs than town life required. Conversation was cheap until it wasn't. Distance was expensive until it wasn't. He'd made his calculations long ago and found the mountains cheaper than most. He watched Crane slide the loaf of bread back behind the counter. He watched Lenora's hand close around her 13 cents. He watched the whole store perform its careful, practiced invisibility, the way people who live inside a man's debts learn to look at the floor when that man is demonstrating his power. When Lenora walked out, Gideon finished his list silently, paid without conversation, and left. He did not follow her. He had a different direction to go first. She found the supplies on her porch just before dark. Lenora had spent the afternoon doing what she always did when the numbers got too bad to keep looking at. She worked. She mended the gap in the fence that the spring thaw had opened up. She weeded 2 rows of the garden. She checked the remaining preserves against the list she'd made and did the math she did not want to do about how long they would stretch. She was calculating that she could get through another 2 weeks before she was genuinely in trouble when she heard something outside. Her first thought was Crane's men. He'd sent 2 of them out before, 6 weeks ago, not to threaten, nothing so direct as that. Just to remind her the payment was overdue, as if the letter he'd sent hadn't made that sufficiently clear. They'd stood in her yard with their hats in their hands and their eyes doing the talking, and she'd told them to ride back to Crane and tell him she'd received the message, and they'd gone without incident. But she hadn't slept well for 3 nights after. She came out the front door with the lamp in one hand and the loaded shotgun in the other. Gideon Mercer was standing at the edge of her porch, with his hands where she could see them. He was taller than she'd registered in the store. She'd barely looked at him. Truth be told, her attention entirely consumed by Crane. He was broad across the shoulders in the way men get from actual work rather than effort, and he had a quality of stillness about him that she associated with people who spent a lot of time alone outdoors. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and his face was the kind of weathered that comes from years of sun and cold, not neglect. On the porch boards around him, bread, flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, dried fruit, 4 jars of put-up peaches, a tin of baking soda, a slab of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. She looked at all of it. Then she looked at him. "What is this?" she said. "Supplies," he said. "I can see they're supplies." She had not lowered the shotgun, which he noticed without reacting to. "What are they doing on my porch?" "I brought them." Stared at him. He stared back, not challenging, not nervous. Just waiting. "I don't take charity," she said. "I'm not offering charity." "Then what would you call this?" She gestured with the lamp at the collection of goods arranged across her porch boards. "Alone? Because I have more than enough of those." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition of a fair point. "I'd call it correcting something that bothered me," he said. "I don't know you. Gideon Mercer. I trap and guide in the high country above the ridge. I've been in Briar Ridge about 9 years. I know who you are." She'd heard the name everyone in the area knew. Gideon Mercer existed the way they knew the mountain existed, as a feature of the landscape that kept to itself and occasionally made itself relevant. "That doesn't explain this. I was in the store this morning," he said. "I saw what Crane did. Then you saw me handle it." "I did." He didn't add anything to that. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw shadows across the porch boards between them. Off in the pines, something rustled, a small night thing going about its business. "I don't want him to think he broke me," she said. "And if people see me accepting supplies like I can't manage." "Nobody will know it came from me," Gideon said. and you can manage. I could see that this morning. That's not the point. Then what is the point? He was quiet for a moment. She had the impression he was choosing words the way a man chooses footing, on uncertain ground, not for effect, but for accuracy. The point is that Crane used hunger to try to take your land, he said. And it bothered me, and the supplies were available. So I brought them. She stood looking at him for a good 10 seconds. Then she lowered the shotgun. You can come inside, she said. There's coffee, whatever's left of it anyway. No need, he said. Just wanted to make sure you got them all right. He turned to go, and she said, Mercer. He stopped. I'll work for this, she said. Whatever you paid, I'll work it off. I'm not going to just take it and say thank you and be done. He looked back at her over his shoulder, that same almost not quite smile. I figured you'd say something like that, he said. All right, I'll think on what needs doing. And then he walked off into the dark, back toward wherever he'd come from, and Lenora stood on her porch, with the lamp in one hand and the gun in the other, and looked at the supplies arranged around her feet. Her stomach growled. She went inside and cut 2 slices of the bread, and ate them standing at the counter, without ceremony and without guilt, and told herself she would figure out the rest of it in the morning. 3 days passed before Gideon came back. He appeared at her fence line mid-morning while she was wrestling with a stuck gate hinge, and the first thing he said was, You're working against it. Lift and push at the same time. I know how hinges work, she said. You're working against it, he said again, and came through the gap she'd left in the fence, and showed her what he meant a lift and push motion that freed the pin and let the gate swing smooth. He stepped back and she swung it twice to confirm. Trapping gear needs overhaul, he said. I've got winter sets to maintain. It's record work, mostly keeping track of the line locations, what each set produced the previous season, where I've been and what's depleted. I'm not good at the writing part of it. I can keep records. I know. You ran Everett's mine accounts. She looked at him. How do you know that? People talk. What else do people say? That you're better with numbers than most men in this county, he said. And that you've been managing alone out here since February, without asking for anything from anyone, which most men in this county also couldn't do. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She decided to not do anything with it. Bring the gear, she said, and the records if you have them. We'll see what needs doing. He brought both the following morning, a pile of winter trapping gear in various states of disrepair, and a battered journal with 4 years of entries written in a hand that was functional but not comfortable. Numbers squeezed into margins and location notes that made sense to their author and probably no one else. Lenora sat with the journal at her kitchen table and worked through it while Gideon spread his gear across the porch and began the systematic business of inspection and repair. She could hear him through the window, the occasional scrape of metal, the sound of whetstone on blade, not much else. He worked quiet. She built a proper record system from what she found in the journal, cross-referencing his line locations against the season yields, flagging the areas that had been overtrapped based on declining production, noting the sets that had consistently outperformed, and what season and weather conditions had prevailed during the good years. By midday, she had 4 pages of organized analysis. She brought them out to the porch. Gideon looked at them for a while without speaking. She had the impression he was actually reading, not just appearing to read, which she respected. This section here, he said, pointing to her 3rd page. The North Fork line, you've got it marked as depleted. Based on what you recorded, the yield dropped 60% over 3 seasons. It did, he nodded slowly. I stopped running it heavy 2 years ago. Rotate it east. Then your east line should start showing the same drop in another season or 2, based on the pattern. You'll want to start resting segments before then, not after. He looked at the page again. Then he looked at her. I knew the lines were getting thin, he said. I didn't know it was moving that fast. Now you do. They stood for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The sun was straight up overhead, and the air had the flat, pressing quality of late August heat that wanted everyone to stop moving and sit down. I'll bring more gear tomorrow, Gideon said, and whatever other records I have. All right. He gathered the pages carefully and folded them into his jacket. There's good work in this, he said. What you did here. She almost said it was nothing. She stopped herself. It wasn't nothing. She'd spent 3 hours on it and done it right. I know, she said. And for the second time, she thought she saw that almost smile. It was during the second week of their arrangement that Gideon began asking questions about Crane. He did it carefully, the way he did most things, not pressing, just introducing the subject and leaving room for her to decide what she wanted to say about it. They were sitting on her porch in the early evening, she with the ledger she'd been building for his trapping records, he with a piece of harness he'd been working over, and he said, without particular emphasis, "How long have you had the loan with Crane?" "Everett took it out 3 years ago," she said, "to buy the back 40. "What were the terms?" she told him. He listened. "That interest clause," he said. "The delinquency escalator. That's not standard." "I know it's not standard." "Did you know before you told Everett to sign it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't there when he signed it. Crane came out when I was away. Said Everett needed to move fast or the land would go to someone else." She looked at the ledger in her lap. Everett trusted people. It was something I loved about him and something that drove me halfway to crazy. Gideon was quiet. He kept working the harness. "Crane does this a lot," he said. It wasn't a question. Talk to anyone in this county who's bought land from him or borrowed money from him. The ones who will talk anyway. Why don't more of them talk? She looked at him. Because he holds the paper on half their lives. You say something against Crane and Briar Ridge, you'd better have your debt paid off first. Otherwise, you're just making trouble for yourself. Gideon nodded. His hands had stopped on the harness. "What's on that land of yours?" he said. "The homestead." "What's underneath it?" She frowned. "Why, you're at the foot of Cutter's Ridge. That whole formation runs mineral. I've been in the high country long enough to know what that ground looks like when there's something in it." He looked at her steadily. "Has anyone ever told you there might be silver under your property?" The word hit her somewhere in the chest. "No," she said slowly. "Everett never mentioned. Did he have any papers? Any records? Anything official? Letters from anyone?" She thought of the box under the bed. The one she'd been through twice since February, looking for anything she'd missed, anything useful. She'd found the loan document, the property deed, some personal letters, receipts. She hadn't looked at everything carefully. She'd been so focused on the debt, the numbers, what she owed. "There's a box," she said. "I haven't gone through all of it." Gideon set the harness down. "It might be worth going through it again," he said. "All of it. Carefully." She looked at him. His expression was even, giving nothing away, but there was something behind his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Not alarm. Something quieter than alarm. The look of a man who has done enough mental arithmetic to think he knows the shape of a problem he doesn't yet have all the pieces for. "Why?" she said. "What do you think is under my land?" "I think," Gideon said, choosing words carefully, "that Bartholomew Crane wants your property badly enough to use your hunger as leverage instead of just making you a fair offer. And men like Crane don't get that particular kind of determined without a reason." The evening had gone properly dark around them while they talked. The mountains above the ridge were gone in the blackness, invisible but present. Lenora could feel them the way she always did at night, a mass of solid, indifferent weight against the sky. Stood up. "I'll look at the box tonight," she said. She found the geological survey folded inside an envelope addressed to Bartholomew Crane. It had been tucked between two personal letters at the very bottom of the box, the kind of thing that might have slipped there accidentally, or might have been deliberately placed where someone in a hurry going through a dead man's papers wouldn't look twice. Lenora sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and read it 3 times. The survey had been conducted in May of 1886, 14 months before Everett died. It documented a significant silver vein running beneath the eastern portion of the Whitfield homestead, extending into the mountain formation to the north. The survey was signed by a geological consultant, whose name she didn't recognize, and it was addressed to Bartholomew Crane at his commercial address in Briar Ridge. Crane had known about the silver for over a year Everett's death. Lenora put the survey on the table and sat back and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then she went back to the box. It took her another hour to find the second thing. It was a single page from Everett's personal journal, not the journal itself, which she had, but a loose page that had gotten separated from it, Probably when he'd torn it out to show someone or keep separately. For some reason, she would never know. The handwriting was Everett's, cramped and hurried the way it got when he was agitated. March 14th. Section 7. Barton told me the inspector came through last week, sent by management. I asked Barton which inspector because I didn't hear about any official visit. Barton said he wasn't sure who authorized it. I went down and had a look at the 7 supports today. Something's been moved. The double cross bracing on the east wall, I don't know how to say this except it looked wrong. Shorter than I remembered. I'm going to talk to the foreman tomorrow. Section 7 was the section that had collapsed. Everett had written this entry in March. He died in June. Lenora read it twice. Then she set both documents on the table side by side, the geological survey, the journal page, and sat looking at them until the lamp began to sputter from low oil. She had suspected, in the way a person suspects something that would break them if they looked at it directly, that Everett's death had not been the simple accident the company and the sheriff had called it. She'd had no proof. She'd had only the particular wrongness of it, the fact that Everett had been careful, always careful, the last man you'd expect to be caught in a roof fall. Now she had something closer to proof. She put both documents back in the box. Carefully, she set the box under the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and held her hands together in her lap and let herself feel what she was feeling for exactly 2 minutes, because 2 minutes was what she could afford. Then she stood up and went to the window and looked out at the mountains. In the morning she would show Gideon. In the morning there would be decisions to make. But tonight, in the dark and the quiet of the only home Everett had ever given her, Lenora Whitfield let herself understand, finally and completely, the full size of what Bartholomew Crane had done. And she made herself a promise. He was going to answer for every bit of it. She showed him at first light. Gideon arrived at her fence line just after sunrise, the way he'd taken to doing no announcement, no particular ceremony, just his boots on her path and the sound of the gate swinging open. Lenora was already on the porch with the box and 2 cups of coffee that weren't quite hot anymore, and she handed him one without speaking and set both documents on the boards between them. He read slowly. She watched him read. He went through the geological survey twice the way she had. Then he picked up Everett's journal page and held it closer to the morning light, as if the extra brightness might change what the words said. Didn't. When he set it down, he didn't say anything for a while. March 14th, he said finally. He died in June. 3 months. Gideon looked out across the yard toward the ridge line. He had 3 months between writing this and the collapse. He wrote that he was going to talk to the foreman. I don't know if he did. I don't know what happened after. She picked up her coffee cup, found it had gone cold, set it back down. The foreman at Red Elk was a man named Bassett. He left Briar Ridge about 2 weeks after Everett died. Took his family to Denver, somebody said. I thought it was just people move. Now I don't know what to think. Gideon looked at the survey again. This was addressed to Crane, yes. How did it end up in Everett's box? I don't know. Maybe Everett found it. Maybe someone gave it to him. Maybe it's been there since before he died, and I just didn't look carefully enough. She stopped. Or maybe whoever went through the house after the accident didn't look carefully enough either. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Someone went through the house after he died? Crane sent a man out to inventory what Everett had left behind. Said it was standard practice for creditors to document property against outstanding loans. I didn't know enough at the time to tell him no. She paused. I know enough now. Gideon picked up both documents and turned them over in his hands. He was not a man who gestured while he thought he went very still instead, and she was starting to recognize this as the sign that his mind was working hard. Can't take this to the sheriff, he said. No. Crane owns the sheriff. I know. The magistrate in Cutter's Flat is better, but Crane has money in his brother-in-law's ranch, and that tends to make magistrates careful about whose side they land on. Lenora looked at him. You've thought about this before. About Crane. I've had dealings with men like Crane, he said. Different places. Same pattern. He set the papers back on the boards. The survey is federal land documentation. That makes it a federal matter. Crane knows that, which is why he's been pushing you toward a private settlement instead of letting things go through any kind of official channel. The Federal Land Office, she said. Durango. He nodded. If you can file this survey with a federal officer along with the note about the mine inspection, and if you can document the irregular terms of the loan, they have to at minimum freeze the property against foreclosure pending investigation. Crane can't foreclose on land that's under federal review. That buys time. It buys more than time if the investigation goes the right direction. He looked at her directly. But getting to Durango is the problem. It's 2 days through the mountains. Crane has eyes on the main road. If he finds out you're moving to go federal with this, he's going to move to stop you, and he's going to move fast. Lenora looked at the documents between them, the survey with its neat damning notations. Everett's handwriting on the torn journal page, cramped and urgent, the handwriting of a man who had seen something that troubled him and didn't yet know how much it mattered. "I need to copy these," she said. "Everything. Multiple copies, different locations." "Agreed. And I need the loan document. I need to go through it with someone who knows contract language, because I think there are irregularities in it beyond the interest clause, but I'm not trained in law. I know a man. Edwin Pratt, he was a territorial attorney before his wife got sick, and he came out here to be closer to her family. He's been ranching north of town for 4 years. Crane doesn't hold his paper. You think he'd help? I think Edwin Pratt hated Bartholomew Crane before most people in this county had a reason to. His wife borrowed money from Crane's predecessor, different man, same practices, and that debt followed them across 2 states. Gideon's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind it. His wife died 3 years ago. He stayed. Lenora absorbed this. "All right," she said. "Can you arrange a meeting?" "I'll ride out today." He stood, picked up the papers, and handed them back to her with the care of a man returning something irreplaceable. "Lock these somewhere other than that box, and not in the house." "Springhouse," she said. "There's a loose stone in the back wall." He nodded. "Good." He was halfway to the gate when she said Mercer. "Stop." "Thank you," she said, "for last night. What you said about the land, about going back through the box. If you hadn't." She stopped, because finishing the sentence would have required saying something, like "I might have gone another month without looking," and that felt too close to admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, that grief had made her stupid about certain things, had put whole areas of her life behind a door she hadn't been able to make herself open. Gideon looked back at her. "You would have found it," he said. "You're the kind of person who finds things." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he went through the gate and up the road toward wherever he kept his horse. And Lenora stood on her porch with the documents in her hand and the morning air going warm around her, and told herself to keep moving. Stopping was not available. Edwin Pratt was a thin, deliberate man of about 60, who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and cattle, and who had, Lenora discovered, a mind like a steel-jaw trap. He looked at the loan document for 4 minutes, during which time he did not speak or move except to turn the pages, and then he set it on his kitchen table and looked at her over the top of it. "Where did your husband sign this?" he said. "At Crane's office." "I wasn't present." "Was there a witness present?" "The document shows a witness signature." A man named She leaned over and pointed. "Colton Reeves." "Reeves." Pratt's expression shifted slightly. "Reeves works for Crane. Has for years. He's on Crane's payroll, not as an employee exactly, more as a convenience." "Is that a problem for the contract?" "It's a complication. In theory, a witness to a contract signing shouldn't be an agent of the party with financial interest in the outcome." He tapped the page. "This clause here. The delinquency escalator. Do you see how it's written?" She leaned over again. He put his finger on the relevant section. "It's written to look like it references a standard 30-day grace period. But the definitions section at the back, most people never read the definitions section, redefines delinquency to include any payment that arrives after the 15th, not the end of the month. If your payment was due on the 1st and you paid it on the 16th, technically you were delinquent under this contract, even though most people would call 16 days reasonable." "Everett paid on the 20th, she said slowly. "One time, 2 years ago. He was waiting on wages. And did Crane apply the escalator?" "He said there was an adjustment. Everett thought it was a mistake. He argued it, but Crane had the paperwork, and Everett," she stopped. "Everett wasn't a paperwork man." Pratt sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Gideon, who was sitting against the wall with his hat on his knee, and then back at Lenora. The loan document has irregularities that a territorial court would likely find actionable, he said. The witness issue, the definition section that's intentional obscurement of terms, which is a form of fraud. Combined with the geological survey showing Crane knew about the silver before your husband took out this loan. He paused. That changes the character of the entire transaction. It's no longer a routine land loan. It becomes a document designed specifically to manufacture a legal mechanism to seize property Crane already knew was valuable. Kitchen was very quiet. That's what I thought it was, Lenora said. What it is. He tapped the papers again, and the journal entry about the mine inspection. That's harder. It's your husband's account of something he observed, not a signed document. But combined with the survey, combined with the loan irregularities, it creates a pattern that a federal investigator would be very interested in. What do I need to do, she said. File in Durango. File everything the survey, certified copies of the loan document with my attached analysis of the irregularities, the journal entry. He looked at her steadily. And you need to do it before Crane realizes you have the survey. Once he knows that document is out of his control, he's going to act. Crane is not a patient man when he feels cornered. How long do we have before he suspects something? Pratt and Gideon exchanged a look. He probably already suspects, Gideon said. He sent men out once before to pressure you. He's been watching. Then we don't have long. No, Pratt said, you don't. They were 5 days into planning the Durango trip when Crane's men came. There were 2 of them, which was Crane's typical approach enough to communicate seriousness, not so many as to look like what it was. They rode into her yard mid-afternoon while she was bringing in water from the well, and they had the easy, unhurried manner of men who do not expect to be refused. The one who spoke was called Holt. She had seen him before in the store near Crane's office. He was somewhere in his mid-30s with a flat, affectless face and pale eyes that didn't bother with warmth even for show. Mrs. Whitfield, he said from his horse. He did not get down. Mr. Holt. Mr. Crane asked us to follow up on the matter of your outstanding note. He said it pleasantly. He's been patient, given your circumstances, but the situation has reached a point where he needs resolution. She set down the water bucket, slowly so her hands were empty. Mr. Crane knows my position, she said. It hasn't changed. He thought you might say that. Holt reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He wanted you to have this. It's a formal notice of his intent to pursue foreclosure proceedings if the debt is not satisfied within 14 days. He leaned down from the horse and held the paper out. Lenora crossed the yard and took it. She unfolded it and read it. It was exactly what he'd said it was, properly formatted, with the sheriff's office listed as the filing party. The sheriff's involved, she said. The sheriff is an officer of the court, Holt said. These things go through proper channels. The second man, who had not spoken, moved his horse slightly to the left. Just slightly, enough to be between her and the gate. Mr. Crane also wanted me to let you know, Holt continued, that he's a reasonable man. He doesn't want trouble. He understands this land has sentimental value to you, and he's willing to increase the compensation offer he made previously. Considerably increase it. How considerably? He said to tell you it would be enough to relocate comfortably. Start somewhere fresh. He paused. He said sometimes a fresh start is the best thing for a person who's been through what you've been through. She stood holding the foreclosure notice and looked at Holt and thought about what was buried in her Springs house behind a loose stone, and what Edwin Pratt was finishing writing up in his kitchen north of town, and what the ride to Durango looked like according to the map Gideon had drawn for her the previous evening. Tell Mr. Crane I appreciate his concern for my comfort, she said. And tell him my answer is the same as it's always been. Holt studied her for a moment. The pleasantness didn't leave his face, but something beneath it changed a slight tightening, like a rope being drawn incrementally tighter around a post. That's disappointing to hear, he said. Mr. Crane was hoping you'd take the opportunity to be practical. I am being practical, she said. This is my land. Practically speaking, I intend to keep it. He looked at her for another moment. You have 14 days, he said. Mrs. Whitfield. He turned his horse, and the second man followed, and they rode out through her gate and up the road without hurrying, which was somehow worse than if they had. She stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then she went to find Gideon. She found him at the tree line above her property, where he'd taken to watching from when he was in the area. She'd noticed the spot 3 days ago, the slight displacement of brush, a broken branch at the wrong angle. She'd said nothing about it because she had decided she didn't mind. "I heard," he said, before she could speak. "How much?" "Enough." He came down from the tree line and stopped near her. 14 days is tighter than we planned. Pratt said he'd have the analysis finished by Thursday. "If we leave Friday, that's 8 days, she said. "That still gives us 6 days margin. It assumes Crane doesn't move faster once he figures out what you're doing. Then we have to make sure he doesn't figure it out." She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the detail in his face, the old scar along his jaw she'd noticed before and never asked about, the way his eyes were darker in shadow than in sunlight, more gray than she'd first thought. "Do you think Holt suspects you're involved?" "Probably. I haven't been subtle about being around." He said it without apology. "I figured visible was safer than hidden. A man seen clearly doesn't look like a man hiding something." She thought about that. "That's either very smart or very risky," she said. "Little of both," he said. She almost smiled. She caught it before it got all the way out. "Friday," she said. "We leave before dawn," agreed. She turned to go back down to the house, and he said, "Lenora." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She turned back. "The offer Crane made," he said. "The money to relocate. Was it genuinely enough to matter? I'm not asking to judge. I'm asking because it affects how desperate he's feeling." She considered the question seriously, the way he'd asked it. "If this were only about survival," she said, "and if I didn't know what I know now, it would have been enough to tempt me." Which means he thought it would be enough to work. "Which means he's worried," Gideon said. "A man who's confident doesn't raise his offer. He lets the clock run out." She nodded. "Friday," she said again. Friday. The days between the visit and their departure had a particular quality that Lenora would remember afterward: a taut, vibrating stillness, like a wire pulled too tight. Kept her routine unchanged on purpose. Garden in the morning. Fence work in the afternoon. Lamp out by 9. She did not want anyone watching the house to notice anything different. Gideon came once, briefly, to confirm the route and the timing. He brought Pratt's completed analysis document, sealed in an oilskin pouch with the other papers. He didn't stay long. They both understood that the less movement there was, the better. Wednesday, she rode into town. She did it deliberately, for the same reason Gideon had chosen to be visible, because disappearing from normal patterns was its own kind of signal. She bought salt and a spool of thread at the hardware, nodded to the people she knew along the street, stopped briefly at the post office. Crane was coming out of his office as she passed. He stopped. They looked at each other across 10 feet of dusty Main Street, and the whole thing was perfectly ordinary and completely charged with everything neither of them said. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, mild, pleasant. "I hope you've been considering your options carefully." "I think about little else," she said. His eyes moved over her face with that measuring quality she'd come to know. Looking for something, a crack, a hesitation, some sign that the 14 days were doing their work. She gave him nothing. "Wise woman," he said. "Take care of yourself out there." Kept walking. She was halfway to the end of the street before her hands stopped shaking. Thursday night she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and went through every piece of it: the route, the documents, the timing. She thought about Durango and the federal land office there, and the officer Pratt had told her to ask for by name, a man who had apparently earned a reputation for not being in anyone's pocket. She thought about what happened if they got there and filed and came back, and whether Crane would accept the federal freeze or try to fight it, and what fighting it would look like for her. She thought about Everett's journal page. The double cross bracing on the east wall, I don't know how to say this except it looked wrong. He had known something was wrong. He'd written it down. He'd planned to talk to the foreman. And then something had happened to what he knew, or to who he'd told, or to the supports themselves. She didn't know which, and might never know completely, but she knew enough. She rose at 3 in the morning before the plan called for it, because lying still had become unbearable. She dressed in the dark and checked the oilskin pouch one more time, verified the contents, tied it closed. She made coffee she couldn't taste, and ate half a biscuit she didn't want, and sat at Everett's table in Everett's house and waited for Friday to begin. Gideon arrived at 4:15. He came to the back of the house, which they'd agreed on. He had 2 horses his own, and the mare he'd quietly arranged to have reshod 2 days earlier while Lenora was in town, without making any obvious connection to the trip. He'd also packed enough for 2 days without resupply, without being asked. She came out with the pouch and her coat, and he looked at her face and said nothing about the sleeplessness in it, which she appreciated. "Ready," he said. She tied the pouch to her saddle. Patted the mare once on the neck. "Let's go," she said. They rode out in the dark, moving quietly through the thin pre-dawn air, taking the back trail that ran north along the creek before cutting west toward the high country pass. The plan was to avoid the main road entirely for the first 8 miles, rejoining it only where it climbed into terrain that Crane's town-based riders would find difficult to push through quickly. For the first 2 miles, there was no sound but hooves on soft earth, and the occasional creek noise, and the settling of the mountains in the last hour before daylight. Lenora rode with the pouch pressed against her left side where she could feel it. She was cold. The pre-dawn in the high country had a different quality than morning, darker and more complete, the stars still very bright, the world not yet committed to the day. She was thinking about the federal officer's name that Pratt had given her, running it through her mind so she wouldn't lose it under pressure, when Gideon's hand came up sharp. Stopped. He was still, head turned, listening to something behind them. She listened. At first she heard nothing. Then, just at the edge of perception, hoofbeats. 2 horses, maybe 3, moving fast on the main road to the south, parallel to their position, heading west, toward the mountain pass. "He knows," Gideon said quietly. "How?" She kept her voice down instinctively. "Doesn't matter how." He was already turning his horse, looking up the slope above them, calculating something. "He doesn't know exactly where we are or which route we're taking, or those riders would be on this trail, not the main road. But he knows we're moving, Wednesday," she said. "When I was in town, someone saw something, or Pratt's place isn't as quiet as we thought." He looked at her. "Can't go back." "I wasn't going to go back." "I know." Something shifted in his expression, brief, unguarded there, and gone. "The high pass. It's the long way and the terrain is rough after the summer storms, but it's the one route he won't expect because no one uses it anymore." "How rough?" "Rough," he said honestly, ledge trail in places. "Your mare will need to be led for about a 1/4 mile. I can lead her." "I know you can." He turned his horse north, toward the mountain's darker face. "Stay close and don't talk unless you have to. Sound carries up here." She fell in behind him, and they moved into the dark, away from the sound of hoofbeats on the road below, up toward the high country where Crane's riders wouldn't follow, where the trail was difficult and cold and uncertain, and where the documents tucked against Lenora's side were worth more than anything Bartholomew Crane had ever owned. She rode with her jaw set and her eyes on Gideon's back ahead of her. 14 days, Crane had said. She wasn't going to need 14 days. She was going to need 2. The high pass had no name on any map Gideon owned. He called it the Shelf Route, which was descriptive enough, a series of narrowed sled trails, cut into the mountain's western face by decades of elk migration, and the occasional desperate trapper who'd needed a way through when the main road was blocked or watched. It was not a route anyone used by choice. The summer storms had done what summer storms always did at elevation, loosened rock, softened the dirt between ledge sections into something closer to paste, and taken out 2 stretches of the trail entirely, leaving gaps that required the horses to be led across loose scree with nothing reassuring on the downhill side. Gideon had used it twice before, both times alone. Both times in better weather than this. The sky had been clear when they started. By the time they reached the first serious elevation, around 6 in the morning, a bank of cloud had moved in from the northwest with the particular purposeful efficiency of high country weather that doesn't announce itself until it's already on top of you. Not a full storm. Something worse in its way, a low, pressing overcast that cut the visibility, made the rock surfaces damp without quite raining, and dropped the temperature 15 degrees in the space of an hour. Lenora didn't complain. She also didn't pretend it wasn't difficult, which Gideon respected more than if she had. "How much farther to the ledge section?" she asked. Her voice was even, but he could hear the cold in it, the slight tightening that happens when a person is working to keep their jaw from shaking. "Half-mile," he said. "Maybe a little more. And after the ledge?" "It opens up. The descent on the west side is rough, but wide. We'll make better time." She nodded and kept riding. The mare was doing better than Gideon had privately expected. She was a practical horse, not young, not flashy, but the kind of animal that assesses a situation and moves through it rather than arguing with it, which in terrain like this was worth more than speed or spirit. He watched her pick her footing with a steady, almost businesslike attention, and he thought that horses and their owners often resembled each other in the ways that mattered. They reached the ledge section 40 minutes later. It was a quarter-mile of trail cut into rock face, with a drop to the left that Gideon didn't measure and didn't invite Lenora to measure either. The trail itself was 18 inches wide in the generous sections and maybe 14 in the places where the winter had chipped at it. Passable for a careful person leading a calm horse. Not passable for anything but a careful person leading a calm horse. He dismounted and looked back at her. "We lead them through," he said. "Keep her nose at your shoulder, not too close behind you. Don't look down." "I wasn't planning to look down," she said. She was already off her horse, and he noticed she'd taken the oilskin pouch from her saddle and tucked it inside her coat, against her body. He caught him noticing. "If she slips and I have to let go of the reins," she said, without embarrassment, "I'm not losing the documents." He didn't have anything to say to that. It was the right call, and she'd made it without drama. He went first, his horse following close, testing each section of trail before he committed his weight to it. The rock was wet from the overcast, and his boots found less purchase than he wanted. He moved slow and deliberate. Behind him, he could hear Lenora's mare breathing steady, rhythmic, the sound of an animal concentrating. They were 2/3 through when the mare's back hoof broke through a section of trail edge that had looked solid. He heard it, a sharp crack, and then the scramble of hooves finding nothing, and Lenora's voice, low and urgent, saying something to the horse that wasn't a command so much as a negotiation. He stopped and turned, which was its own risk on the ledge, and saw the mare, with her hindquarters dropped and her front legs braced wide, fighting for balance. And Lenora, with both hands on the lead rope, leaning back against the horse's weight with everything she had. The mare was going to go over, or she wasn't. There was a moment, one of those moments that seems to last longer than it has any right to, when it could have gone either direction. Then the mare found purchase. One hoof, then the other, scrambling up from the broken edge and onto solid trail. Came up shaking, blowing hard, pressing her nose into Lenora's chest. Lenorsa stood, holding the lead rope, with her hands locked around it and her eyes closed for 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Go," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were shaking. "We need to keep moving." Gideon turned and moved forward and didn't say anything about it until they were off the ledge section and onto the wider trail on the other side, where the terrain opened up and the cloud was thinning slightly and they could breathe again. Then he stopped and looked back at her. "You all right?" he said. She was checking the mare's legs, running her hands down each one, methodical, feeling for anything wrong. The mare stood for it with the patience of an animal that has decided it trusts the person handling it. "She's all right," Lenora said. "Nothing broken. She's scared, but she's all right. I asked if you were all right." She looked up at him. There was a scrape on her right palm from the rope. He could see the raw skin from where he stood. She looked at it herself for a moment, then pressed it against her coat. "I'm fine," she said. "The palm, it's a scrape. I'm fine." She straightened up and took the mare's lead again. "How far to the descent?" He watched her for another moment. 2 hours, he said. "Give or take. Then let's not waste it," she said, and started moving. Below them, on the main road they'd abandoned before dawn, 3 of Crane's riders spent the morning pushing west toward the mountain pass and finding nothing. They arrived at the pass entrance around 9, determined that the Durango Road was clear of traffic, and spent 2 hours confirming what was already apparent: no one matching Lenora Whitfield's description had come through. Holt, who had organized the pursuit from Briar Ridge, received this information at noon. He stood in Crane's office and delivered it without embellishment, because Holt had learned that Crane preferred information plain. They didn't take the main road, he said. Crane was at his window, looking out at the street. He had his hands clasped behind his back in the way he did when he was working through something. No, he said. There's a back trail along the North Creek, but it doesn't connect to anything useful without... Holt paused. There's the shelf route, the old elk trail above the north face. No one's used it in years. Crane turned from the window. Mercer would know it. Yes. How long does it add to the journey? Half a day. Maybe more if the storm damage is bad. Crane thought about this. Get to Durango, he said. Don't go through the mountains. Take the South Circuit Road. It's longer, but it's passable. If you ride through the night, you can be there before they file. Holt looked at him, and when we're there, Crane returned his gaze. The mildness in his eyes had a different quality than usual, still controlled, but with something pressed tight behind it, the way a fire looks when it's been shut inside an iron stove. The documents cannot be filed, he said. I don't care how you manage that, but you will not do anything that creates a federal incident. Nothing visible, nothing that can be traced. Understood. If you can't stop the filing, find out who they spoke to and what was filed. I need to know the exact scope. And the woman? Crane turned back to the window. Bring her back if you can do it quietly, he said. If you can't do it quietly, then don't. Holt took his hat from the chair and left. The western descent was rough in the way that rough means something different in the mountains than it means anywhere else, not dangerous in the ledge trail sense, but punishing in the way it demanded constant attention from both rider and horse, picking through loose rock and the eroded channels that the summer rain had gouged down the hillside. Gideon's horse stumbled twice. The mare stumbled once, recovered without incident. They came down off the mountain just after 1 in the afternoon, onto the wide valley floor that ran south toward the main road. Cloud cover had broken up by then, and the sun was doing its level best to compensate for the cold morning, and the valley smelled like warm grass and pine sap and the distant water smell of the river to the west. Lenora reined in at the valley floor and looked back up at the mountain face they'd come down. From below, the shelf route was invisible, just mountain. Just rock and thin tree line, and the indifferent vertical face of the San Juans going up into sky. Nothing to indicate anyone had ever come through it. I can't believe that's a route, she said. It's barely a route, Gideon said. How did you even find it? Got chased up at once. 8 years ago. Decided afterward that knowing it well was better than being surprised by it again. He didn't elaborate on the chasing, and she didn't ask, and they both let it sit there as one of those pieces of a person's past that explains something about them without requiring a full accounting. They joined the main road a mile south of where it came through the pass, moving west toward Durango. The road here was good packed dirt, relatively level, enough traffic that 2 riders attracted no particular attention from the occasional freighter or horseman going the other direction. Gideon set a pace that was efficient without being obviously urgent. We should make Durango by late afternoon if we keep this up, he said. The land office closes at 5, she said. He checked the sun. We'll make it. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But we're in decent position. She rode for a while without speaking. He'd noticed she went quiet when she was working through something internally, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone sorting through too much to let any of it out yet. Gideon, she said. Yeah, when we get there. The federal officer Pratt said to ask for a man named Calloway. Thomas Calloway. I remember. I want to be the one who presents the documents, she said. Speaks to him. He looked at her. I wasn't planning to take that from you. I know you weren't. She paused. I just wanted to say it out loud. So it was clear. It's your land, he said. Your husband's notes. Your case. He held her gaze for a moment. I'm here to get you there and back. That's all. She looked at him a beat longer than the conversation required. You're more than that, and you know it, she said. But thank you for saying it. He didn't answer, and they rode on toward Durango in the afternoon light, the mountains behind them and the documents safe against Lenora's side, and Crane's riders somewhere on the Southern Circuit Road pushing hard in the wrong direction. The federal land office occupied a solid brick building on Durango's Main Street, 2 blocks from the rail depot, with a sign above the door that was serious and bureaucratic, and the most welcome thing Lenora had looked at in recent memory. It was 4:47 when they tied their horses at the post outside. She didn't run, but she walked fast. The office was a single large room with a counter running its width, a wall of filing cabinets behind it, and the particular smell of a government space paper and ink, and the specific variety of wood polish that only official buildings seem to use. A clerk was at the counter, a young man with spectacles and careful handwriting, in the process of covering his inkwell and organizing his desk in the manner of a man wrapping up for the day. "We're here to see Thomas Calloway," Lenora said. The clerk looked up at her, then at the clock on the wall, then at Gideon behind her. "Mr. Calloway is— Tell him it's regarding the Whitfield homestead in Briar Ridge," she said, "and that it's time-sensitive. Those are the words, time-sensitive." Clerk looked at her for another moment, then went through the door behind him without further comment. She stood at the counter and told herself to breathe. Gideon came up beside her. He didn't say anything. He was simply there, that particular kind of presence she'd come to recognize in him, not crowding her, not performing reassurance, just present. She found it steadying in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable with, because being steadied by someone required a kind of admission she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Thomas Calloway came through the door before she'd finished thinking about it. He was perhaps 55, with a short gray beard and the kind of broad, weathered build that suggested he'd done physical work earlier in life, before this desk had claimed him. He looked at her, then at the clock, then at her again. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Yes, I have documents to file. Federal Land Survey documentation and evidence of fraudulent debt practices involving property in Briar Ridge, Cutter County." She set the oilskin pouch on the counter and opened it. "I'd like to do that before 5 o'clock. Calloway looked at the documents she laid out. He did not look at the clock again. "Come through to my office," he said. It took 40 minutes. Calloway read everything. He asked questions, precise, legalistic questions that told her Pratt had been right about him. He asked about the chain of custody on the geological survey, how she had found it, what condition it was in when she found it. He asked her to walk through the loan timeline and the specific language of the delinquency clause. He read Pratt's analysis twice and asked 2 questions about it that indicated he had understood it fully on the first read and was verifying his understanding on the second. He asked about Everett's journal entry. She told him what she knew and what she didn't know, because she'd decided before she walked in here that she would be precise about those 2 things and not blur the line between them. "The entry documents his observation and his intention," she said. "It doesn't document what he found out afterward, or whether the conversation with the foreman happened, or what the foreman said." "I don't have that. But the foreman left Briar Ridge shortly after your husband's death," Calloway said. 2 weeks after, yes." He looked at the journal page again. "And the inspector your husband referenced. Did he identify the inspector by name?" "No. He said he asked Barton, another miner, who it was, and Barton didn't know who authorized the visit." Calloway set the page down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the way of a man who is not actually looking at the ceiling, and then he leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "what I can do today is register the Geological Survey as a federal document, which triggers an automatic freeze on any foreclosure or transfer proceedings involving the property until the survey's provenance is examined. That happens by law, automatically, once this is in my register. Crane cannot legally take your property while that review is active. How long does the review take? Minimum 60 days. Likely longer given what's here." He tapped the stack of documents. "Additionally, the loan irregularities Pratt has documented fall under territorial fraud statutes. I'm going to forward his analysis to the territorial prosecutor's office. That's not a guarantee of prosecution, that's their call, but it goes into the record. And the mine inspection? Everett's notes?" Calloway was quiet for a moment. "That's harder," he said honestly. "What you have is suggestive. It's not sufficient on its own to support a criminal charge. But I'm going to note it in the file, and I'm going to ask the territory's Mining Safety Office to pull the Red Elk inspection records from the period in question. If there was an unofficial inspection ordered by Crane, there should be a paper trail somewhere. Those things don't happen in complete silence. She looked at him. And if Crane tries to interfere with the review? Interfering with a federal land review is a federal crime, Calloway said, which is considerably more serious than anything he's done so far. He picked up his pen. I'm going to need you to sign the registration documents. And I'd suggest you leave certified copies of everything with me and keep your originals somewhere safe. I brought duplicates, she said. She pulled the second set from the pouch, Pratt's duplicates, the ones he'd insisted on making before she left. These are for your records. The originals come back with me. Calloway looked at the duplicate set, then at her. You planned ahead, he said. I've been planning this for 2 weeks, she said, while being watched. He nodded slowly and began filling out the registration form. They were outside and back at their horses before the last of the afternoon light left the street. Lenora stood with one hand on the mare's neck and the oilskin pouch in the other lighter now, the duplicates left behind, but the originals still there, and she let herself feel what the last 8 hours had cost her physically. Her palm was stiff where the rope had scraped it. Her legs had the particular fatigue that comes from riding difficult terrain under stress rather than just distance. Her back had been tense since before dawn, and it had apparently decided to announce that fact all at once. She breathed out. Done, Gideon said beside her. It wasn't a question. Done. She looked at him. Calloway's registering the survey tonight. The freeze is automatic once it's in his record, so Crane can't foreclose. Not legally. Not while the review is open. She paused. He's going to be furious. Yes, Gideon said. When we get back, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Yes, he said again. She looked at him. He wasn't softening it or inflating it into something manageable. He was just agreeing with her assessment because her assessment was accurate. She found that she preferred it to reassurance. We should find somewhere to stay, she said. Start back at first light. They found a decent rooming house 2 streets from the land office, not the same establishment. Gideon suggested quietly, which she understood. In case anyone came looking, it was better not to be obvious. She took a room with a solid lock on the door and a window that faced the rear yard, and she put the oilskin pouch under the mattress and lay on top of the bed fully dressed for a while, looking at the ceiling. She thought about Calloway's pen moving across the registration form. Thought about the freeze. Automatic, he'd said. By law. Crane could not take her land while that review was open. Whatever he tried next, whatever pressure or threat or legal maneuver he reached for, the land itself was temporarily beyond his reach. That was real. That was done. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to understand that it wasn't over. Then she got up, checked the lock on the door, checked the pouch under the mattress, and tried to sleep. They left Durango at 5:15 the next morning, taking the main road east, this time no need for the shelf route on the return, and every reason to make good time. The sky was clear and cold, and the mountains ahead of them had their high peaks just catching the first light, orange-pink against a blue that was still more night than day. They had been riding for 40 minutes when Gideon's horse shortened its stride. Lenora caught it immediately. She'd been watching him, she realized. Not constantly, but in the way a person watches something they've come to rely on for early information about their surroundings. What, she said. Riders behind us, he said. 3. Moving faster than road traffic, she didn't turn. How far? Half mile, maybe less now. Crane's men. I don't know yet. He scanned the road ahead. The terrain here was open, broad valley floor, the road running straight for another 2 miles before it bent north toward the pass. No cover, no branching route, nothing useful. If we run, we look like we have something to run from, she said. We do have something to run from. They don't know that we filed, she said. They don't know what happened in that office yesterday. If they knew, they'd have come to the rooming house last night. Gideon thought about this. She could see him thinking. So they're still trying to stop us from filing, he said. They don't know they're already too late. Which means if we ride normally and let them catch up, they don't know what they're dealing with. And if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong, she said. But running makes it worse. He looked at her sidelong. All right, he said, we ride normal, but give me the pouch. No. Lenora, no, she said it flat and final. If something happens, you can get clear faster than I can. They want me. not you. If I have the documents and they take me, they'll think they've won. They won't know about Calloway's registration. They won't know the freeze is already in effect. She paused. And when they find out, that's a significant risk to take with your own safety. I'm aware, she said. Keep riding. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to let them take you, he said. It came out different from anything he'd said to her before, less measured, less careful. Just direct. I know, she said, but let me handle the talking. The riders caught them a mile later. It was Holt, and two men she didn't recognize harder looking than his usual companions, the kind of hired that cost more and asks fewer questions. Holt pulled alongside and matched their pace, and for a moment all five of them were just riding east together in the morning light like it was perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Whitfield, Holt said. Mr. Holt, you're a long way from Briar Ridge. So are you. His eyes went to Gideon, then back to her. Mr. Crane is concerned about your well-being. He'd like you to come back with us. That's thoughtful of him, she said. I'm on my way back now. He'd prefer you came back with us. Directly. The pleasantness in his voice was wearing thin this morning. She could hear the frame of the other thing under it. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'll make my own way. Mrs. Whitfield. He moved his horse closer, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his saddle. I'm going to be direct with you. Mr. Crane knows you went to Durango. He knows you went to the land office. He paused. Whatever you were planning to do there, it would be better for everyone, including you, if you came back with us before you did anything that can't be undone. She held his gaze. The thing about federal land offices, she said, is that they're open until 5 o'clock. Holt stared at her. We filed yesterday at 4:47, she said. The registration is done. The freeze is in effect. Mr. Crane cannot legally foreclose on my property while the federal review is open. She kept her voice completely level. So I'll be going back to my home now, which is still my home, and I'd appreciate it if you gave Mr. Crane my regards. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the two harder men moved his horse up on Gideon's side, and Gideon's hand came up not threatening, not drawn, just positioned, and his eyes went to the man with an expression that communicated something very specific and very clear, which was that this particular calculation should be done carefully before committing to it. The man held. Holt looked at Lenora. Something moved through his flat, pale eyes, not quite uncertainty, but the first cousin of it. He was a man who worked from positions of leverage, and leverage required knowing what you held. He didn't know what he held right now. You're making a mistake, he said. I've been making mistakes since February, she said. I'm still here. She clicked to the mare and moved forward. After a moment, she heard Gideon's horse fall in beside her. And after another moment, the moment where everything could have gone a different direction, the moment she felt in her spine without looking back, she heard Holt's men hold their position and not follow. She rode with her back straight and her eyes forward, and the pouch pressed against her side for another quarter-mile, before Gideon said quietly, "They're not following." She nodded once. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was going like a mallet on iron, but her voice was steady, and she was still moving east toward Briar Ridge and her land, and the accounting that was coming for Bartholomew Crane. The mountains ahead of them came fully into the morning light, and the road stretched on, and she rode toward all of it without slowing. They rode back into Briar Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty and saddle-sore, and carrying something that felt different from what they'd left with. The documents were still in Lenora's pouch, the originals, safe. But the copies were in Calloway's office in Durango, registered in a federal ledger, and that fact had changed the weight of everything. She could feel it in the way she sat her horse, not lighter exactly, but differently balanced, like a load that had been repositioned rather than removed. Gideon rode beside her without talking. He'd been mostly quiet since the encounter with Holt on the Durango road, which she'd come to understand was his way of processing rather than withdrawing. When Gideon went quiet, he was thinking, and when he was done thinking, he'd say something that turned out to have been worth waiting for. She was right about that. They were a mile outside Briar Ridge when he said, "He'll know by now." Holt would have sent a rider ahead, she agreed. He's had a day to think about what the federal freeze means for him. Gideon looked at the road ahead, the familiar bend. where it came around the stand of cottonwoods and the first buildings of Briar Ridge came into view. A desperate man with money and local connections is more dangerous than a confident one. I know that. He's going to come at you differently now. Not through the debt, not through the foreclosure. That avenue is closed. He paused. He's going to try to discredit what you filed. Challenge the survey's authenticity. Challenge how you came to have it. Maybe claim it was stolen from him. She'd thought about this the whole second day of writing. It was in Everett's possession, she said, in his box with his papers. It's not theft. Crane's attorney will find a way to frame it as something else. He glanced at her. Pratt needs to know we're back. I'll ride to him tomorrow morning. Tonight would be better. She looked at him. Tonight, she said. They came around the cottonwoods, and Briar Ridge opened up ahead of them the main street, the building she'd walked past her whole married life, the general store with its sign facing the road. Ordinary, exactly as it always looked, except for what was in front of Crane's office. 3 horses she didn't recognize. A man she didn't know standing near the door, not local, not the hired rider type Crane usually used. Something else. He had the particular posture of a man who carries paperwork for a living and knows it makes him dangerous. Attorney, Gideon said quietly, seeing it at the same moment. From where? Crane's local man is not local. That's a territorial suit. He brought someone in. Gideon kept his eyes forward, not staring. Don't stop. Ride through normal. She did. She rode down Briar Ridge's main streets at the same pace she always used, looked at the people she recognized, nodded at 2 of them. She felt the man outside Crane's office look at her. She did not look back. They passed the office and kept going and turned off the main street toward the road that ran north to Pratt's place. He's moving faster than I expected, she said. He's scared, Gideon said. Good. Edwin Pratt heard them out at his kitchen table while his coffee went cold beside him, and when Lenora finished telling him about Callaway and the registration and the encounter with Holt on the Durango Road, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment in the way she'd come to associate with him, running through implications. Callaway is solid, he said. If he registered it, it's done correctly. The freeze will hold. He came back down from the ceiling and looked at her. The territorial attorney Crane brought in, do you know the name? I didn't get close enough to ask, she said. Describe him. Did. Pratt's expression shifted. That sounds like it might be Aldous Webb, he said. Webb practices out of Denver. Corporate land cases, primarily. He's expensive. He tapped the table. Crane doesn't hire Webb for a routine dispute. Webb specializes in challenging the provenance of contested documents. He's going to argue the survey was stolen, Gideon said. He's going to argue whatever gets the federal freeze lifted, Pratt said. The survey's provenance is the soft point. You found it in Everett's box, that's your account. Crane will argue it was taken from his office, that it was never Everett's property, that you obtained it illegally. He looked at Lenora. Can you document that the box was in Everett's possession before he died? Any witness who saw him with it? She thought about it. Really thought. May Hubble, she said slowly. Came out to help me the week after Everett died. She helped me go through his things. She saw the box. She saw me find the loan document in it, I remember, because she was standing right there when I pulled it out. Did she see the survey? No, I didn't find the survey that night. But she can confirm the box was Everett's, that it was in his house, that she witnessed me going through it. She paused. She'll be afraid to say so. Most people in this county are afraid to say anything that reflects badly on Crane, Pratt said. That's been his protection for a long time. How do we get around that? Gideon asked. Pratt looked at him, then back at Lenora, and he said something that surprised her. You don't get around it, he said. You go through it. May Hubble lived in a small house at the edge of town. Behind the church she attended twice weekly with the dedication of someone who had been finding comfort in routine since her husband died 7 years ago. She was 63 and moved with the slight stiffness of an old hip injury that had healed imperfectly, and she made the best preserved fruit in the county and knew everyone's business and never volunteered any of it, which made her trusted in the specific way that quiet people are trusted. Lenora knocked on her door at 8 in the morning. May opened it, took one look at her, and said, "Come in before someone sees you on my porch." Lenora came in. The kitchen was warm and close and smelled like the lavender May kept in a dried bunch over the window. May poured coffee without asking and set it on the table and sat down across from her and folded her hands and said, "Tell me what you need." Lenora told her. May listened without interrupting. She was a good listener, attentive, without performing attentiveness, the kind of listener who actually absorbs what she's hearing rather than waiting for her turn to respond. When Lenora finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You want me to say, in front of whoever needs to hear it, that the box was Everett's," May said. "I want you to say what's true," Lenora said. "That you were there. That you saw me go through his things. That the box came out of this house and nowhere else." May looked at her coffee cup. "Bartholomew Crane holds the note on Cora Denning's shop," she said. "Cora is my closest friend, if Crane decides to call that note early." "I know," Lenora said. "I know what I'm asking." May was quiet for another moment. "That man," she said. It came out with a weight behind it that wasn't anger exactly, but had lived next door to anger for a long time. "You know what he did to the Hendersons after Amos died. He had that property reclassified. Said Amos had been running a commercial operation without proper licensing, and suddenly the widow Henderson owed fees that nobody had ever mentioned before." She paused. She left, took her children to her sisters in New Mexico. "Property went to Crane. I didn't know the details," Lenora said. "But I knew the shape of it. He does the same thing. Always the same thing." May looked up at her. "And we all look at our feet when it happens because we're afraid it'll be us next." She sat with that for a moment. "My Abe would be ashamed of me." "You're not ashamed," Lenora said. "You're afraid. That's different, is it?" "Yes," Lenora said. "Being afraid and doing it anyway, that's something. Looking away because it's easier, that's different." May looked at her across the table for a long time. "I'll say what I saw," she said finally, "if it comes to that. If someone official asks me." She held up a hand before Lenora could speak. "I'm not standing up in Main Street. I'm not making speeches. But if a federal officer or a territorial judge asks me under oath what I witnessed, I'll tell them the truth. That's all I'm asking," Lenora said. May nodded once. Then she picked up her coffee. "You should talk to Walt Greer," she said. "He won't say so to your face, but he's been carrying something about the Red Elk accident for 2 years. Brother was in that section." Lenora stared at her. "His brother survived," May said, "but only because he'd gone back up to the surface 10 minutes before it came down. Walt's never talked about it publicly, but I've seen his face when Crane's name comes up." She paused. "Sometimes the people with the most to say are the ones nobody's ever thought to ask." Walt Greer ran a small blacksmith operation on the south side of town. He was a big, taciturn man of 45 who shoed horses and repaired wagon hardware and had, Lenora now understood, been carrying something for 2 years that had no clean place to put itself. She went to his shop that afternoon. He saw her coming, and she watched him consider closing the shop door, and then watch himself decide not to, and that small decision, the moment of not closing the door, told her something important. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. He kept working, hammer on iron, not looking at her. "You've been away." "Durango," she said. "Federal Land Office." The hammer paused, just for a beat, then continued. "I heard something about that," he said. She stood near the door and didn't move closer because she could read a person who needed space the same as she could read a loan document. "May Hubble said your brother was in Section 7, she said. The hammer stopped. Walt Greer set it down on the anvil and turned. His face was the face of a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has not decided yet whether to let it out. "Danny's in Pueblo now," he said. "Got out of mining entirely. He doesn't talk about it." "Does he talk about the inspection?" she said. "The one that happened before the collapse?" Walt looked at her for a long, steady moment. "How do you know about that?" he said. "Everett wrote it down," she said. "He saw the supports after the inspector left. He wrote that they looked wrong." Something crossed Walt Greer's face that she had no clean word for. Relief and grief arriving at the same time, the way they do when a person finds out that someone else also saw the thing they've been second-guessing themselves about for years. "Danny told me," Walt said, "a week before the collapse. He said the east wall bracing in 7 looked shorter, like someone had pulled the cross pieces. He told the shift foreman, and the foreman told him he was imagining it. He stopped. Foreman was Bassett. Bassett left Briar Ridge 2 weeks after the accident. Yes, he did. Walt picked up a rag and worked it through his hands without purpose. Danny asked me afterward, after Everett and the others died, he asked me if he should say something. The sheriff, to whoever was investigating. He stopped again. Told him no. I told him Crane owned the sheriff, and it would only make trouble. He looked at Lenora directly. Told my brother to be quiet, and he was quiet, and I've thought about that every day since. Lenora didn't say anything. She let him sit with what he'd said. What do you need from me? He said. The same thing I asked May Hubble, she said. Say what you know if someone official asks. Tell them what Danny told you. Give them Danny's name and where he is. Danny's not going to want to come back here. He may not need to. If there's a federal investigation and they have his name and location, they can send someone to him. She paused. But Walt, the investigation only happens if the pattern is visible. One piece of evidence is a detail. 3 pieces of evidence is a pattern. I have the geological survey. I have Everett's notes. If I have Danny Greer's account of what he saw in that section before it came down. It starts to look like what it was, Walt said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. I'll write to Danny tonight, he said. I'll tell him what you told me. What he decides after that is up to him. He looked at the anvil. But for my part, if someone asks me what my brother said, I'll tell them. She thanked him and left his shop and stood in the afternoon heat of the street for a moment, with her eyes closed. May Hubble, Walt Greer, 2 more pieces. She needed more. The problem with going to more people was that Briar Ridge talked. It always had. In a town this size, 3 conversations in 2 days was already enough to create a pattern that someone would notice and mention somewhere that would get back to someone who owed Crane a favor or a debt or an obligation of the kind that doesn't get written down. She was thinking about this when she came back around the corner toward the main street and almost walked into Barnabas Witt. He stopped. She stopped. Witt was the mine foreman she'd seen in Crane's store the morning she'd set 13 cents on the counter. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a drinker's nose and the hands of someone who'd spent 20 years underground before moving to surface work. He'd been the one who stood at the counter that morning, not moving, not speaking, looking at the floor while Crane slid the bread away. She'd thought about him since. The particular quality of his stillness that morning, not indifference, she'd decided. Something else. They looked at each other in the middle of the street. Mr. Witt, she said. He looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. He also, she noticed, did not move to go there, Mrs. Whitfield, he said. He cleared his throat. I heard you went to Durango. Word gets around. It does in this town. He shifted his weight. He was not a man comfortable with the kind of conversation that required more than functional exchange, and this clearly was becoming that kind of conversation whether he wanted it to or not. Look, there's something. He stopped. She waited. Crane came to me, Witt said, after you filed in Durango. He asked me to sign a statement about the Red Elk accident. He was looking somewhere past her shoulder. He wanted me to say on record that the section came down due to equipment failure. Natural deterioration of old timber. Nothing unusual about the inspection history. She kept her voice steady. And what did you tell him? She said. I told him I needed to think about it. He finally looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has gotten very tired of the weight of it. I haven't signed it. Why not? He exhaled through his nose. A long, complicated sound. Because I know what that section looked like 3 months before it came down, he said. I was on the surface crew. I wasn't underground, but I saw the inspection report that went through official channels after the accident. The one that said natural deterioration. He paused. The supports in Section 7 were Douglas fir, cut and fitted the year before. 3-year-old Douglas fir doesn't deteriorate into a collapse condition without help. Lenora's heart was going very fast. She kept her face even. You knew this, she said, 2 years ago. Yes. And you were quiet. The word landed on him the same way she'd heard it land on Walt Greer. I've got a wife, he said. 3 kids. Crane holds the deed on my house. I know what happens to people who make trouble for him in this county. I know, she said. I also know what happened to Everett. He flinched. It was small, but it was real. If I sign his statement, Witt said, I know what I'm signing. I know what it covers up. He looked at her again. What happens if I don't sign it? What happens if someone asks me, official, what I know? The same thing I told May Hubble and Walt Greer, she said. Tell the truth. What you saw, what you know, what you can say under oath. She paused. You're not alone in this, Mr. Witt. There are others. He blinked. Something shifted in his face. Who else? He said. Enough, she said. More than Crane knows about. He was quiet. She could see the arithmetic going in him, the same arithmetic she'd done for 5 months, the calculation of risk against conscience, the question of whether staying quiet was actually keeping him safe or just keeping him complicit. Don't sign his statement, she said. That's all I'm asking right now. Don't sign it. He looked at her for a long moment. I won't sign it, he said. Then he walked past her, back toward the end of the street, and she stood where she was and let out the breath she'd been holding. 3 days later, Crane made his move. It came on a Thursday morning, and it came all at once, which told her he'd been holding it together and waiting for a moment he thought was right. She was in her yard when she saw the dust on the road, not one rider but several, moving together with a particular purposeful pace that meant official business of some kind. She went inside and got the shotgun, not because she planned to use it, but because holding it gave her hands something to do, and came back out to the porch. Crane arrived with the sheriff, his attorney Webb Holt, and 2 other men she recognized as town councilmen who owed Crane money in various configurations. They stopped at her gate. It was Webb who spoke first. Territorial attorney from Denver, the one who cost more than most people in this county made in a year, stepped forward with a document in his hand and a practiced, reasonable expression on his face. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, my name is Aldous Webb. I represent Mr. Bartholomew Crane in the matter of the promissory note attached to this property and the federal land filing made on your behalf last week. He held out the document. This is a formal challenge to the provenance of the geological survey submitted to the Durango Land Office. We are asserting that the document was taken without authorization from Mr. Crane's private records and therefore cannot be admitted as evidence in any federal proceeding. She did not take the paper. She looked past Webb at Crane, who sat on his horse with his hands folded on the saddle horn and his mild eyes giving nothing away. That survey was in my husband's box, she said. In this house. That is your claim, Webb said. Mr. Crane's position is that the document went missing from his office prior to your husband's death, and that its presence in your home constitutes unauthorized possession. He paused. Additionally, the promissory note's review period has elapsed. We are here to notify you that Mr. Crane intends to file for an emergency judicial review of the federal freeze, citing the contested nature of the submitted evidence. She stood on her porch and looked at all of them. Crane had thought this through. He'd waited until he had the legal challenge ready, the attorney present, the sheriff standing there to give it official weight. He'd brought the town council to make it look like community process. He'd timed it for morning, when she'd be alone, when the day ahead of her would stretch full of uncertainty and whatever this confrontation cost her. This was the move she'd known was coming. She'd known it was coming, and she'd spent 3 days getting ready for it. Sheriff, she said, looking past Webb at the man she'd dealt with her whole time in Briar Ridge. The sheriff was a man named Pollard. He was 50, a little soft in the middle now, and he had been Crane's instrument in this county for 6 years. He looked at her from his horse with the studied neutrality of a man who has spent a long time practicing, looking like he's not on anyone's side. Sheriff Pollard, she said, are you here in an official capacity? I'm here to keep the peace, he said. Then keep it. She stepped down off her porch. Because I'm going into town. Webb blinked. Mrs. Whitfield, I heard what you said, she told him. I'm going into town. She looked at Crane. You want to resolve this, mister? Crane? Then come to Main Street and let's resolve it in front of everyone. Crane looked at her with something she had never seen in his face before the first visible crack in that smooth, reasonable surface. He covered it almost immediately, but she'd seen it. She went to the fence and unlatched the gate. I'll be there in an hour, she said. Bring whoever you want. She went back inside, put down the shotgun, and went to find Gideon. Gideon's was at Pratt's when she got there, and Pratt had already sent word to May Hubble and Walt Greer. She didn't know how he'd known to do that she hadn't sent word herself, and when she asked him, he said only that he'd had the impression this day was coming and had made a few arrangements. "What kind of arrangements?" she said. "The kind that involve people who have had enough," he said. She looked at him. "Edwin," she said, "what did you do?" He almost smiled. Edwin Pratt almost never smiled. "I may have spoken," he said carefully, "to a few individuals in this county who have personal experience with Bartholomew Crane's business practices. In private, without suggesting any particular course of action." He folded his hands. "People make their own decisions." "How many people?" "Some," he said. "We'll see who shows up." Gideon was watching her from across the room. He said, "Are you ready for this?" She thought about what ready meant. She didn't feel ready. Her hands were cold, and her stomach was tight, and she had a fairly clear sense of all the ways this could go badly. "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." He nodded once and stood. They came into Briar Ridge's main street just before 11 in the morning. Crane was already there, he and Webb and the sheriff and Holt and the councilman, positioned in the street in the way of men who have chosen ground and want you to notice they've chosen it. The street was not empty. It was not full either, not yet. But there were people, more than a usual Thursday morning. She recognized faces: the hardware man in his doorway, the woman who ran the laundry, the rancher from the valley who came to town twice a week. They were positioned with the careful, plausibly deniable casualness of people who just happened to be standing somewhere. Crane looked at the crowd, and something changed in his posture. He had expected her to come and be outnumbered. She walked into the center of the street and stopped. "Mr. Crane," she said, loud enough to carry, "your attorney says that geological survey was taken from your office." Crane looked at Webb. Webb stepped forward. "That is our." "I'm talking to Mr. Crane," she said. She kept her eyes on Crane. "If that survey was yours, why was it addressed to you? Why does it document the silver beneath my husband's property? And why did my husband write, 3 months before that mine section came down, that someone had been in and disturbed the supports?" "Those are allegations," Webb said. "Unsupported." "May Hubble was in my house the week after Everett died," Lenora said. Still to Crane, still loud, she watched me go through his box. "The box that came out of this house. She can say under oath where it came from." From somewhere along the street, May Hubble said, "I can." Heads turned. May was standing near the post office, her hands folded in front of her, her chin up. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and was done making it. "Barnabas Witt," Lenora said, "you told me what the Section 7 supports looked like before the collapse." "Say it." Witt was standing near the hardware store. He hadn't moved. He looked at the ground. He looked at Crane. He looked at Lenora. "Douglas fir," he said. 3-year-old timber doesn't rot into a collapse." Not without help. The street had gone very quiet. Webb was talking something legal, something about federal process and evidentiary standards, and Crane was still, completely still, in a way she had not seen before. The mild expression was gone. What was under it was harder and less pleasant, and entirely visible now for the first time. Then a woman's voice from the other side of the street said, "He took my husband's claim, too." She didn't know the woman. But the woman was there, and she was speaking, and her voice had the sound of someone who had been waiting years for a room big enough to say it in. And then Walt Greer said something, and a man she didn't know said something. And a shopkeeper she recognized from the dry goods store, 3 doors down from Crane's office, opened her door and came out and began speaking with the precision of someone who had been composing what she had to say for a long time. 1 voice, then 5, then more. The street filled in ways it hadn't filled since she'd first come to Briar Ridge. People who had been looking at their feet for years were looking up now, and they were talking, and the accumulated weight of what Bartholomew Crane had done over a decade was arriving all at once in the morning sun. Crane turned to the sheriff. "Pollard," he said. His voice had dropped the mildness entirely. It was just command now, stripped of its packaging. "Do your job." Pollard looked at the street. He looked at the faces. He looked at Lenora with her documents, and May Hubble with her testimony, and Barnabas Witt with his 3-year-old Douglas fir, and the woman across the street he probably also knew, and the growing number of people finding their voices in the warm morning air. He looked at Crane. My job, Pollard said slowly, is to keep the peace. He looked back at the crowd. And I don't think I'm the one disturbing it. Crane stared at him. In the silence that followed, a rider came hard down the main street from the east, pulling up fast, trailing dust, and the man on the horse was wearing a badge that was not Cutter County's badge. Federal. And behind him another rider. Thomas Calloway from the Durango Land Office had ridden out personally. He pulled up and looked at the scene in the street, and then at Lenora, and she thought she saw the smallest nod, the acknowledgement of a man who had done what he said he would, and come to make sure it held. Mr. Crane, Calloway said, from his horse. I'm here regarding the federal land review of the Whitfield property. I have some questions about a geological survey commissioned in May of 1886. He looked at Webb. Mr. Webb, I'd suggest your client make himself available. This is a federal matter now, and federal matters have a way of expanding when people are uncooperative. Crane stood in the middle of his own main street, surrounded by the people whose silence had been his power, and watched that power dissolve in the way that things dissolve when the single holding force gives way all at once, and with no way to recover what scattered. He had spent years in this town making people feel that they were alone. He had never once considered that Lenora Whitfield would make them feel otherwise. The street did not erupt. That was the thing Lenora would remember most clearly afterward, that it did not become what it could have become. There was no violence, no rushing forward, no moment of mob release that undid everything the day had built. The crowd held itself with the particular dignity of people who have been quiet for a long time and have finally chosen words over something worse. Crane looked at Calloway for a long moment. Then he looked at Webb. Webb gave him a small, tight shake of the head, the professional signal that the ground had shifted beneath them in ways that required reassessment rather than escalation. Whatever Crane had built his morning around, it had not included a federal officer riding in from Durango personally. We'll cooperate with any legitimate federal process, Webb said to Calloway. Smooth, practiced, the language of a man who knows when to stop fighting a current and start swimming sideways. Mr. Crane has nothing to hide. Then this will go quickly, Calloway said. He dismounted and handed his reins to the rider beside him and looked at Lenora across the width of the street. Mrs. Whitfield, you filed correctly. The freeze is in full effect. He said it plainly for the street to hear. I came personally because in my 20 years with the Federal Land Office, I have occasionally found that official documents benefit from an official presence. He looked at Crane. Mr. Crane, I'll need an hour of your time and access to your business records, going back to 1885. Crane's jaw tightened. It was the only thing that moved in his face. My office, he said. They went inside Calloway, Webb, Crane, and the second federal rider, who turned out to carry a badge from the territorial prosecutor's office. The door closed behind them, and Briar Ridge's main street was left to itself. For a moment, no one moved. Then Walt Greer said something quiet to the man standing beside him, and May Hubble crossed the street and took the hand of the woman who had spoken about her husband's claim. A woman Lenora now learned was named Clara Petch, whose husband had died in a different mine accident 18 months ago and whose property had gone to Crane inside of 3 months. Clara Petch was 57 and had been living with her daughter's family in a back room since then, and she stood in the street holding May Hubble's hand with the slightly dazed look of someone who has just done something that frightened them and has not yet fully processed what comes next. Lenora went to her. Clara, she said, I didn't know about your husband. Should have known. Clara Petch looked at her. Her eyes were dry. She'd done her crying in private a long time ago, but there was something raw in her expression all the same. The rawness of a wound that has been covered so long the air feels wrong on it. Nobody talked about it, Clara said. Nobody talks about anything in this town. They're talking now, Lenora said. Clara looked around at the people still gathered, the conversations beginning in small clusters along the street. The way the whole atmosphere of the place had shifted from its usual careful neutrality into something Slate probably couldn't have named, but could feel. Something had exhaled. What happens now? Clara asked. Lenora told her what she knew honestly, which meant telling her that she didn't know everything, that federal investigations took time and made no promises, that Calloway could document and recommend, but could not guarantee outcomes. The territorial prosecutor's office had its own considerations and calendar. She said it plainly because Clara had already been through enough people telling her what she wanted to hear. But your husband's claim, Lenora said. If Crane acquired it through the same methods he used with mine, and I think he did, then it goes into the federal record. That's something. That may be everything. Clara Petch nodded slowly. It won't bring Arthur back, she said. No, Lenora said. It won't. They stood together for a moment with that plain truth between them. Then Clara straightened her back and said she needed to sit down somewhere and have a cup of tea and think, which seemed like an entirely reasonable response to the morning, and May Hubble took her to the cafe down the street. Gideon appeared at Lenora's shoulder. Pratt's inside the land office, he said. Calloway let him in as a legal observer, said it was irregular, but given the scope of the documentation, he wanted someone with local contract knowledge in the room. Pratt will hold his own, she said. He'll do more than that. Gideon looked at the closed door of Crane's office down the street. Webb is good, but Pratt is better, and he's angry, and angry is sometimes the better advantage. She looked at the office door, too. How long do you think it takes? She said. Today is just the beginning of it, Gideon said. The real investigation, the mining records, the inspector, Bassett, if they can find him, that's months. I know. She'd known that from the beginning. But today mattered. Today mattered considerably, he said. She looked at him. He was standing close enough that she could see the details of his face, clearly the gray in his hair, the old scar along his jaw, the quality in his eyes that she'd been reading wrong at first, mistaking for distance when it was actually just exactness. He said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't add decoration to either, and she had come to value that more than she could easily articulate. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, direct, without flinching, without the social reflex to soften or deflect. You did this, he said. We did it. No, he said. Not arguing. Just accurate. I helped you get where you needed to go. What happened in that street just now that was yours? The survey. The Durango ride, May Hubble and Walt Greer and Barnabas Witt, you did those things. Carried supplies to your porch once. You did more than that. Some, he said, but not what you're giving me credit for. She looked at him for another moment. All right, she said. We'll disagree on that. We can disagree on it, he said, and there was that almost smile, the one she'd stopped catching and started expecting. The investigation took 4 months and 12 days. It was not clean or simple or swift, and there were moments during those months when Lenora thought it might collapse under the weight of its own complexity, the competing jurisdictions. The witnesses who went cold again when the immediate pressure of that Thursday morning passed, and the old fear reasserted itself, the legal maneuvering by Webb that delayed and complicated and reframed at every possible opportunity. Aldous Webb was very good at his job. She had to give him that. But Edwin Pratt was better. Pratt worked with Calloway's office, and the territorial prosecutor with the methodical, slightly frightening thoroughness of a man who had been waiting a long time to be useful in exactly this way. He reconstructed the chain of Crane's debt acquisitions going back 8 years. He documented 17 separate instances of the same pattern, the artificially tightened debt terms, the strategic timing of pressure against properties that had been surveyed for mineral or timber value, the way Crane's holdings expanded reliably in the wake of deaths and disasters that turned out, on examination, to have convenient timing. The Inspector Everett had mentioned in his journal page was a man named Roy Casper, who had left Colorado entirely after the Red Elk accident and gone to work in the Nevada mining districts. The federal investigators found him in 6 weeks. Casper held out for 3 weeks after being found. Then his own attorney told him what Casper already knew, that the evidence had reached a weight that made his situation considerably worse the longer he waited. Talked. He had been paid by Crane to conduct an informal inspection of Red Elk Mines Section 7 in March of 1886, 3 months before the collapse. Crane's instructions had been specific: assess the stability of the east wall bracing and do not file a formal report. What Casper found was that the bracing was adequate but not robust, sufficient under normal conditions, marginal under heavy load. He had told Crane this. Crane had paid him and told him to forget the visit. Casper had forgotten it, or had performed the version of forgetting that consists of not mentioning it to anyone. Until the section came down, and 5 men went with it, and one of them was Everett Whitfield, and the whole thing was ruled an accident, and the inspector who'd been paid to stay quiet did, in fact, stay quiet, because the alternative required admitting what he'd done. 3 weeks after Casper talked, the foreman Bassett was located in Denver. He had less to say and said it less willingly, but what he said confirmed enough of the pattern to matter. He had not been directly ordered to ignore the deteriorating supports, but he had been told, clearly and more than once, that Section 7 was profitable and that slowdowns for safety assessments were not welcome. Territorial prosecutor charged Bartholomew Crane with federal land fraud, fraudulent debt manipulation, bribery of a public official in the matter of Sheriff Pollard's cooperative silence over 6 years, and criminal negligence in connection with the Red Elk mine collapse. Criminal negligence charge was the hardest. It didn't reach the level of murder. The prosecutor was honest with Lenora about that, and she appreciated the honesty even when it stung. Crane had not ordered the collapse. He had ordered an assessment he knew would find problems, kept that assessment private, and continued to encourage production in a section he had reason to believe was marginal. 5 men had died in that section. The law had specific language for what that was, and it was not the same word Lenora would have used, but it was something. It was on the record. It would follow him. The trial lasted 9 days. Lenora attended every one of them. She sat in the territorial courthouse in a dress she'd had for 3 years and watched Aldous Webb perform the best defense that money and skill could construct, and watched Edwin Pratt dismantle it with the patience and precision of a man who had been building toward this for months. She watched Casper testify with the particular misery of a man turning state's evidence, the combination of relief and that comes from finally saying the true thing after years of saying nothing. She watched Barnabas Witt say, under oath, that 3-year-old Douglas fir did not deteriorate into a collapse without help, and that he had seen the official accident report, and the official accident report did not match what he knew about that timber. She watched the jury. 9 days was a long time to watch people's faces. By the end of the 4th day, she thought she could read most of them. By the end of the 7th, she was fairly sure. On the 9th day, the jury was out for 4 hours, and she sat on a bench outside the courthouse in the autumn air, and Gideon sat beside her without talking. And Pratt paced the length of the corridor inside with his pipe in his hand, and the expression of a man who has done everything he can do and has now entered the particular misery of waiting. The jury came back at 3 in the afternoon, guilty on land fraud, guilty on fraudulent debt manipulation, guilty on bribery, guilty on criminal negligence. The courtroom did not erupt. Like the main street in Briar Ridge 4 months earlier, it absorbed the verdict with a kind of collective exhale, the sound of a long-held breath releasing all at once. Lenora sat very still. She had thought about this moment for months. She had imagined it would feel like something large and conclusive, a door closing, a chapter ending with the weight of everything it contained. What it actually felt like was smaller and more complicated than that. There was relief. There was something that might, in time, become a version of peace. There was the persistent, unanswerable ache of knowing that none of it brought Everett back, that the verdict's language said negligence, where her own heart said something harder and more specific. She let herself feel all of it without trying to resolve any of it into something simpler. Gideon's hand came to rest beside hers on the bench between them, not taking her hand, just there, close enough to touch if she reached. She reached. She held his hand and looked at the front of the courtroom and let the moment be exactly as complicated as it was. The restitution process took another 6 months. Crane's properties were inventoried, assessed, and liquidated through the federal court. What came out of that process was not a clean or perfect accounting. Some of the older claims had changed hands too many times to fully trace. Some of the affected families had moved on and couldn't be located. Some of the losses were the kind that money addresses without really addressing. But the court-appointed administrator was a careful woman from Santa Fe named Ruth Deering who approached the work with an emphasis on finding the actual people rather than checking procedural boxes, and Lenora found herself grateful for Ruth Deering in a specific personal way that she hadn't expected. Clara Petch got enough to buy a small house of her own. Not the property that had been Arthur's, that was gone into too many subsequent transactions to untangle, but enough to stop living in her daughter's back room, and enough to have the particular dignity that comes from a door that is yours to open and close as you choose. The Henderson family in New Mexico received restitution for the property that had been reclassified out from under the widow after Amos Henderson died. They did not come back to Briar Ridge. The money reached them, which was what mattered. Sheriff Pollard resigned before his case could proceed to formal charges, which the prosecutor allowed in exchange for his full cooperation with the Crane investigation. He left the county and did not return. His replacement was a younger man named Ferris, who had the slightly nervous earnestness of someone who is very aware of the weight of the office and determined not to drop it. It was imperfect. All of it was imperfect. Lenora knew that, had known it before any of it began. Accountability, she had learned, is not the same as justice, though it is the closest thing available to it in the actual world. The gap between those two things was where she had to find a way to live. Spent a lot of time in that gap. The silver operation began the following spring under the management of a mining engineer out of Denver named Hargrove, who came with references Pratt had vetted carefully and who charged fair wages and filed accurate safety reports, which turned out to be the fundamental requirements Lenora had set before agreeing to any extraction arrangement. The operation was profitable from its second month. What Lenora did with the profit surprised people, though it probably shouldn't have surprised anyone who'd paid attention to what she'd said and done in the preceding year. She did not build a large house. She did not buy adjacent properties or expand her holdings in the way that wealth in this county had traditionally been used. She paid off what remained of the original debt, erased, officially, satisfyingly, and then she sat with Edwin Pratt for 2 weeks and worked out the structure of what she came to call the Whitfield Mountain Cooperative. It was not a charity. She was careful about that distinction, because she had experienced charity from Crane's angle, the kind that comes with an invoice attached, the kind that creates obligation, and she had experienced it from Gideon's angle, kind that asks nothing and therefore owes nothing, and she understood that what she wanted to build was neither of those things. The cooperative gave ownership shares to the people who worked in it. Miners, support workers, the women who ran the commissary, the men who built and maintained the safety structures. Ownership meant a portion of the profits, a vote in operational decisions, and the specific dignity of having a stake in something, rather than merely working inside it. Community Reserve Fund received 10% of monthly profits. The fund existed for one purpose: to ensure that any family in the region facing genuine hardship, medical disaster, accident, the death of a provider could receive food and emergency support before debt had a chance to become the crisis on top of the crisis. Not a loan, not a transaction, a provision, because Lenora had learned from 13 cents on a counter exactly how quickly hunger becomes leverage in the hands of a man who wants to use it. Clara Petch ran the Reserve Fund administration. She turned out to be exceptionally good at it, with the particular competence of someone who has experienced the problem from the inside and understands it without sentimentality. May Hubble sat on the cooperative's founding board at Lenora's insistence for the same reason. Edwin Pratt drew up every document and reviewed every contract and charged the cooperative exactly what he charged anyone else, and exactly once told Lenora she was building something unusual and worth building, and then returned to the specifics because Pratt was not a man for sustained sentiment, and she liked him exactly as he was. Gideon built his cabin that summer. He did it himself, mostly, the way he did most things systematically, without ceremony, with the thoroughness of a man who builds something he intends to live in rather than show off. It was a solid cabin, low to the ground and well chinked against the winter, set in the trees at the edge of Lenora's property, with a line of sight to her house that she noticed and said nothing about. He continued helping with the cooperative in its first-year scouting routes, working with the miners on safety assessments he was probably more qualified to make than he let on, fixing whatever needed fixing without being asked. He had a particular talent for arriving at the moment a problem needed a physical solution, and then solving it and moving on. He still came to the porch most mornings. The records they'd started with his trapping lines, the yields and patterns she'd mapped from his journal, had become something more elaborate over the year. She'd built him a proper system, and he'd adopted it without complaint. And somewhere, in the daily exchange of information and assessment, their professional arrangement had quietly become something else, the way water becomes ice. No single moment of transition, just a gradual shift that becomes undeniable. She did not pretend she didn't know what it was. She also did not rush it, because she had learned from the last year and a half that the things worth having rarely reward rushing. One evening in October, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with the mountains going dark against the sky and the smell of wood smoke coming from someone's chimney down the road, she said, "Gideon." "Yeah, I'm not done grieving Everett," she said. "I want you to know that. I don't think I'll ever be entirely done." She looked at the mountains. He was a good man who trusted people and worked hard and died because a worse man decided silver was worth more than a life. "Carry that." She paused. "I'll always carry that." Gideon didn't say anything. "What I'm trying to say," she said, "is that what I feel about you doesn't cancel that. I'm not choosing between them. That's not what this is." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You know," she repeated. Not challenging. Checking. "I know Everett was real, and what you had with him was real, and nothing that happens now changes that." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm not asking you to be done. He stopped. "I'm here. That's all. I'm just here." She looked at him. There was nothing complicated about what she felt. That was the surprising part. She had expected it to feel complicated, had braced herself for the guilt and the dissonance of caring about someone new when the man she'd loved was barely 2 years gone. But what she felt sitting beside Gideon Mercer on her porch in the October air was straightforward and plain and real, in the same way that bread when you're hungry is real, not subtle or metaphorical, but simply present and necessary and good. "I know you're here," she said. "I've known for a while." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her since very near the beginning, direct, steady, without performance. "Then that's enough," he said. "For now, that's enough." It was enough. And then, over time, it became more than enough. Not because the grief finished it didn't finish. She'd told him true about that, but because grief and love turned out not to occupy the same space in a person. They ran alongside each other, and she learned to let them both be there, without requiring one to make room for the other. They married the following spring in Pratt's parlor, with May Hubble and Walt Greer and Clara Petch and the cooperative's core members as witnesses. It was a quiet ceremony and a good one. Lenora wore the same dress she'd worn to every day of Crane's trial, because it was her best dress, and she saw no reason a courtroom should get more ceremony than her own marriage. Gideon said what he meant, as he always did. She said what she meant. Pratt, who had been asked to speak on behalf of someone who had no family present, said 3 sentences and then seemed to realize 3 sentences was plenty and stopped. It was exactly right. The frame went up on the cooperative's headquarters building in the summer of their first year of marriage, a proper building on the edge of Briar Ridge, not grand but solid, with room for the administrative office, and the reserve fund's records and a meeting hall large enough for the membership to gather when decisions needed making collectively. Someone, and Lenora never confirmed who, hung a small wooden frame on the wall of the main office during the building out process. Inside the frame, under glass, were 13 coins. Stood in front of it the morning she saw it and looked at it for a long time. 13 cents. She remembered the weight of them in her palm. The walk into town with them, the 4 miles she'd done the arithmetic the whole length of, arriving at the same number each time. She remembered setting them on Crane's counter and watching him look at them the way a man looks at something he's already decided is beneath him. She remembered picking them up and walking out with them, hungry and furious, and more afraid than she'd let herself fully feel at the time. She remembered the walk home. She remembered what was on her porch when she got there. People who came into the cooperative's office sometimes stopped in front of the frame. They'd look at the 13 coins and look around for context and occasionally ask someone what they were for. The staff had various ways of explaining it, some historical, some brief, some that got into more detail than others. When visitors asked Lenora directly, she told them the simple version. Once, 13 cents was everything she had. And then someone filled her empty pantry. And then she used the strength that gave her to build something that meant no one in this county had to face hunger as a weapon. What she didn't always say, what she kept for herself, and the people who had been there was the part that mattered most to her. Not the silver beneath the land, not the cooperative, not even Crane's conviction, though all of those things mattered, and she was glad for all of them. What mattered most was the moment in Briar Ridge's Main Street when Clara Petch's voice joined her own, and then May Hubbell's, and then Walt Greer's, and then more voices than she could track, each one belonging to a person who had been told, implicitly and explicitly for years, that they were alone in what they were carrying. They were not alone. That was the thing Crane had never understood and could never have understood. Because a man who builds his power on other people's isolation tends to stop believing that solidarity is possible. He'd looked at Briar Ridge and seen a collection of individual debts, individual fears, individual people who could each be managed separately and kept from ever realizing that the hand pressing down on them was the same hand. He had been right about the fear. He had been wrong about what fear eventually becomes when someone stands up in the middle of it. Lenora had been afraid too. She wanted to be clear about that to herself and anyone who asked. She had been afraid when she walked into Crane's store with 13 cents and came out with nothing. She had been afraid going through Everett's box in the dark, finding the survey, understanding what it meant. She had been afraid on that mountain ledge with the mare's hoof breaking through the edge and nothing useful below them. She had been afraid standing in the middle of Main Street with her documents and her voice, and no guarantee that any of it would work. Fear was not the absence of courage. She understood that now in a way she couldn't have explained before that year, before all of it. Courage was just fear that had been refused the last word. She had a good life. She wanted to say that plainly, without apology or excessive qualification. It was not the life she'd planned, and it was not the life Everett would have shared with her, and the grief of that ran as a thread through everything, quiet now but present. The way scar tissue is present, you don't see it unless you look, but it's there. It changed the shape of things, and it belongs to you as surely as anything else that's yours. But it was a good life. The cooperative was real and functioning and growing. The reserve fund had helped 14 families in its first year. She knew each family, knew what the help had reached. Clara Petch had her own house and her own front door. May Hubbell sat on the board and argued with everyone about everything, and was usually at least half right. Pratt was drafting an expansion of the cooperative's charter to allow membership from the surrounding mining camps, which would triple the fund and require 3 new staff members, and had sent him into a state of organized happiness that was almost unrecognizable on his face. Gideon was beside her every morning, not in a way she'd been able to predict or plan or fully understand before it was simply true. He was there, steady and particular and imperfect in the specific ways that made him real, rather than convenient, stubborn about certain things, quieter than she sometimes needed, occasionally more patient with a stuck hinge or a difficult horse than with a difficult conversation, and possessed of a loyalty so fundamental that it had apparently never occurred to him to perform it rather than just live it. She loved him for all of it, including the parts that required adjustment. He was not Everett. That was not a failure or a loss. He was Gideon, and being Gideon turned out to be more than enough. She found him one evening that first winter, standing outside the cooperative's headquarters, looking at the building in the way he looked at things he'd helped build, a quiet satisfaction. Not pride exactly. Something more practical than pride. The look of a man who has put effort into something solid and is glad it's standing. Came to stand beside him. "You think it'll hold?" she said. He looked at the building for a moment. "Good foundation," he said. "Built right. Yeah, it'll hold." She looked at it too. The evening light was doing something interesting with the mountains behind the building, making the peaks look softer than they were, the way light sometimes flatters hard things. The smoke from the commissary chimney was going straight up in the still air. From inside, she could hear voices, a meeting in progress, the membership discussing something with the particular volume of a group of people who have recently discovered that their opinions are not merely tolerated, but structurally required. It was not a quiet life. She had decided she didn't mind that. Inside the office, the 13 coins hung in their frame on the wall, catching the last of the day's light through the west window. 13 worn cents behind glass, looking like exactly what they were, small, unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd spend without a second thought if you had more of them, or hold on to with both hands if they were all you had left. She had held on to them once, and then she had held on to the land. And then she had held on to the truth about what happened to Everett, and the truth about what Crane had done and what it had cost, and what it had cost all the other people who'd never been asked to say so. She had held on through hunger and mountain ledges, and a cold night in a Durango rooming house, and 9 days in a courthouse, and 6 months of restitution proceedings, and all the ordinary hard days that don't make for dramatic stories, but accumulate into a life. Some mornings she still stood at Everett's grave, on the hillside above the property where she'd put him in the ground on a February morning 2 years ago, and she said whatever needed saying that day. She didn't do it on a schedule. She did it when it was needed, and sometimes it wasn't needed for weeks, and sometimes it was needed twice in a row, and that was the way of it. She had built something he would have been proud of. She believed that without sentimentality, the way she believed most things plainly, with evidence. Everett Whitfield had been a man who trusted people and worked hard, and thought the land beneath his feet was worth protecting because it was his and his wife's and the foundation of a life they were building together. She had protected it, and then she had used it to make sure the protection extended further than her own fence line, because she had learned in the hardest way available that a fence line is only safe when the people outside it are also safe. And that isolation is not security. It is just a smaller version of the same vulnerability dressed up as independence. 13 cents. The thing she had been most ashamed of that morning in Crane's store was not the hunger, though the hunger was real. It was the feeling of being seen as small, of having a man look at her coins and at her and make a calculation about what she was worth and come up 2 cents short. She was not small. She had always known that, underneath the hunger and the fear and the grief. It had just taken 13 cents and an empty pantry and a quiet mountain man, leaving supplies on her porch and a 4-mile mountain ride and a ride through a shelf route in the dark and a moment in the middle of a dusty Colorado street to prove it to everyone else. She could live with how long it took. She put her hand in Gideon's, and they stood there until the light was entirely gone from the mountains, and then they walked home.